This episode is brought to you by the American Academy of Orthokeratology and Myopia Control. Go to AAOMC.org and join us. Join the war against the myopia epidemic. All right, welcome to the Corrected View podcast. This is a show about orthokeratology. It's a show about myopia control and the people devoted to its role in specialty care. And I'm your host, Matthew Herzberg, the Executive Director of the American Academy of Orthokeratology and Myopia Control. And usually my role on this podcast is to ask the obvious questions. But when we get into a more technical subject, I like to bring on a panel of experts. And that's what I've assembled for tonight's episode. My usuals are Jonathan Skoner and Dr. Cheryl Chapman. Jonathan and Cheryl, welcome to the program. And,
Thank you.
All right. And then I also have our special guest expert, Dr. Michael Lipson. If you don't know Michael Lipson, what's it like being under that rock you've been living underneath? Because he's a big name in the OrthoK community. He's a big name in the scleral community. He wrote a book about orthokeratology called Contemporary Orthokeratology. Michael, thank you so much for joining us for this episode.
Glad to be here.
All right. So the topic that we're going to be discussing tonight comes from a Myopia Profile article, and it's called, "Is Orthokeratology Useful for Control of Low Myopia?" So we've got Jonathan is going to start us out on this topic and be our presenter. So I'm going to turn it over to him. Jonathan, what would you like to tell us about this topic?
I think the topic is really exciting to discuss because I think when you go through your OrthoK career, you kind of go through a spectrum of maybe expectations, a spectrum of what you understand about what OrthoK is capable of and not capable of, and then you have the unknown. And this kind of transverses all three of those of the spectrum because, you know, when you start off, you wonder about these things, and the more you get into it, you start digging into the details and you find out some exciting information. And now I think all three of us are probably going to, I don't know, but I'm assuming all three of us are going to be on a similar aligned page, and that there's still a lot of unknown in this area, but we have a lot of optimism. So I'm excited about it.
All right. So you've provided us with some points, and we're going to go through each one of them. And our first one is, for the purpose of this discussion, what do we consider low or high myopia?
So just a quick comment on that one. Basically, I think we can all agree, if you look statistically or by definition of what high myopia is or pathological myopia is, and we can define myopia in lots of different ways. But in the orthokeratology community, I think there's maybe some differing opinions on this. So it's an interesting point because everything we talk about after this is going to be based on kind of this initial definition that we set forward. So I wanted to hand this off to Michael and ask, Michael, what's your opinion when we're discussing orthokeratology or even myopia control in general? How do you classify refractive errors based on their numeric value? Not much else considered if we just kind of look at refractive error values.
I think certainly the numbers are not agreed upon everywhere, but I think overall, if you're less 2 diopters or less, you can consider that low myopia. Between about 225 and about 5 diopters, you consider pretty moderate, and above 5 is high. We consider over 6 to be a very high myopia, but oftentimes I think we lose sight of the fact that one of the most important parts of this is not the actual degree, but the axial length. And that's what's actually creating the risks for our patients as they elongate in axial length.
Mm-hmm. Cheryl, do you have any thoughts on it?
I agree with that, and I think it's really interesting and poignant that Michael brings that up because I had 2 different cases that were in my clinic today, and one was a case where the child was like a -50, and I was expecting, I hadn't seen his K readings yet, I was expecting to see not that long of an eye. and I saw his axial length before I saw his K readings. It was 24.5 millimeters. And I thought, oh my gosh, he must have flat Ks. I bet his Ks are like 41. And then sure enough, I saw his Ks, and guess what his Ks were? They were like 41. And so on the flip side, I had a patient who, like an hour later, I had a patient who was like a -4, and her axial length was like 23 and a half. But her Ks were like 46. And so it was just like this contrast. And of course, I'm in clinic today thinking about how I'm doing this podcast tonight. And so I'm thinking a lot about this. And then it was like I had these two examples right next to each other. And so, yeah, it's really interesting because I was thinking to myself, okay, what is the risk for future pathology for that 23.5 millimeter eye that's only a -75, -50, -75 versus that, that was a 24.5 millimeter eye that was that lower power, and it was a 23.5 millimeter eye that was already a -4. It was really interesting for me to contemplate that.
So I set you up for that one pretty well then, didn't I?
Sure did. Thank you. We did not practice that ahead of time.
We did not. So.
I was going to say, you guys are creating perfect segues. I appreciate this. Yeah, no, I agree with both of you guys. I think axial length is actually our next small point of discussion. But kind of going back to what Michael said, if we look at myopia just in a black and white category, there really is no such thing anymore. So kind of digging into this deeper now, we're going to have to start talking about all those cans of worms that Cheryl opened up, because those are all the important points. But let's just say when we refer to low myopia, I think that's a good point, maybe 2 diopters and less, for the purpose of our discussion, when we're referring to efficacy in relation to orthokeratology. So.
Okay, so let's move to axial length as a progression indicator in pre-myopes, emerging myopes. Jonathan, what do you have to say about our next point?
So axial length is creating almost a paradigm shift in the way that we view myopia, whether we're treating a pre-myope, an emerging myope, or an existing myope. As Cheryl was pointing out, it can dramatically alter the way that we expect maybe the rate of progression and or the risk of future pathology in the eye. Referencing the article that you did at the beginning, Matt, at the Myopia Profile article, if you look into what they reference in some of the scientific articles that they reference, it talks about how axial length is really a prime indicator for younger pre-myopes. It can be so useful in determining if they're going to likely become a myope, and then not only that, a high myope, versus someone who's an established myope. It's a useful piece of information. So I think it can alter the way that we kind of classify and decide to treat or not treat a low myope based on their prior axial length measurements, if they're had. So, Michael, I wanted to turn it to you and talk to you a little bit about that. What are your thoughts on axial length and early or pre-myopes?
I think if we look at the early myopes, we kind of look into the future. We have our little crystal ball, and we say, well, we know from a number of studies that axial length over 26 millimeters as an adult is a high risk factor. So when we look at kids and know that they are going to grow and develop, our goal should be to say we want to keep them well under that and limit axial growth. So to get back more specifically to your question, I think, the difficult part of it for us right now is you can't really look at this and have normative data. We don't have a real gospel that says this is normal axial length for emmetropes developing, and if it's more than this at a specific age, then this is an at-risk child. There are a number of studies, and I think we're trying to develop that normative data right now. So, for example, you might say, okay, if I have a 6-year-old and they're over, I don't know, what is this one chart that I have, over 22.5 millimeters, that may be an at-risk child. But there are a few studies that are trying to propose what is normal. Again, I think we have to take axial length as an important contributing factor, and as one contributing factor. We have to look at the refraction, we have to look at progression, family history, and all the factors together. So I don't know, I hope that starts a little bit of conversation, and Cheryl and Jonathan, you can kind of chime in a little bit based on that.
Yeah, I'll speak a little on that. I know I've mentioned on some other podcasts, and some people may have heard me say this before, but I've started measuring axial length on pretty much every kid that comes through clinic, whether they're hyperopic, whether they're myopic, and I found that to be extremely useful in some specific cases, because if I have data on that kid when he's 5 years old, and then he comes back again when he's 6, and then he comes back again when he's 7, I can watch for these trends. And you know, the article we're referencing tonight, it was written by Kate Gifford, right? Well, in those white papers that came out a couple of years ago, you know, she kind of accumulated data from a lot of different studies, and it talked about how we are going to see that axial length growth is going to start to pick up and accelerate up to 3 years before they even transition into myopia. And then that 12 months prior to transition into myopia, from hyperopia to myopia, you're going to see an even greater acceleration. And so what I'm doing is I'm trying to watch for these trends. And I've got kids who they're kind of right there on the cusp. And I know there's this family history and maybe a sibling that's already in myopia management. And so a lot of times what I'm doing is seeing this at-risk 5 or 6 year old back maybe every 3 months or maybe every 6 months, and rechecking their axial length along with their refraction to kind of see. And I've got kind of a fun case where mom is like a -8 before she had LASIK, and older brother was, I think he was like -150 when he started myopia management at age 6. And his little brother, we saw, wasn't as hyperopic as we expected at a young age. And then as he like was coming right up to, he's like at plano right now, and I've got him on atropine therapy. And that's the exciting thing is, okay, yeah, it's almost like a crystal ball. And I've seen like his axial length was rapidly progressing right up till plano. We intervened with atropine therapy, and now I've seen him back for 2 different follow-up visits where he's now stable. I'm like, this is so cool. Like, he is gonna stay hopefully around this plano, or maybe only progressing to a very, very low myopia instead of maybe becoming a -8 like his mom was. So that's pretty cool.
One other point, I guess, is that really, truly with doing orthokeratology, we really have to depend on axial length, because we really can't monitor the refraction, a true refraction. We can do some modifications to try to estimate what it is and changes in parameters, but truly, if you're doing OrthoK, the best way to monitor progression is with axial length.
All right, so I asked for questions before we started this podcast, and one of the questions that I got from our audience was, what level of myopia to axial length is medically acceptable to prescriptions for traditional therapies without the need of OrthoK, you know, atropine, etc. So I wanted to throw that into the conversation as well. Cheryl, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I'm talking about. If I understood the question correctly, that's kind of what I'm talking about, where I saw this kid and I'm like, I don't really care what your axial length is. What I've seen is that it's progressed very fast. And I see that you're only 6 years old and you're going to become so myopic if I don't do something. So why not start now? Why wait? And so we started him on atropine therapy.
Okay.
Are you guys comfortable prescribing OrthoK for an 8-year-old child who's -1?
I am, personally. I don't know about you, Jonathan.
I would be. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think that's going to be, you know, kind of the crux of this whole conversation. But kind of, yeah, getting to that point, I would be, for lots of reasons that we're going to hopefully discuss. But sure. How about you, Michael?
I definitely would. And again, it would kind of be evaluating the whole picture, meaning you're looking at the refraction, the age, progression, previous prescriptions that the kid has been wearing, and basically, family history and just other risk factors.
Circling back to something that Michael said a moment ago that I think is somewhat relevant. When we're looking at axial length and we're treating these orthokeratology patients, one thing that I've noticed and has been documented, I know a lot of practitioners are noticing this, is once you start a patient on myopia management, whether it's atropine, whether it's soft multifocal contacts, or whether it's orthokeratology, a lot of times when really good myopia management is happening, you will get some thickening of the choroid. And that choroidal thickening will often lead to an axial length measurement that slightly makes the eye look slightly shorter than it was previously. And I have seen a couple of cases, specifically with OrthoK, where it made me feel like these kids were kind of progressing, and we either switched into OrthoK from a different therapy or we added dual therapy, and all of a sudden I get them back for that follow-up visit, and now I've seen their axial length, instead of getting a little bit longer each time, now it's a little bit shorter, and I'm like, bingo. I know that the eye is like recognizing that there's myopia management happening. I know I'm getting that stop signal for axial elongation, and I'm getting that choroidal thickening. So that is like so exciting for me when I see that.
That's a great point. It does happen, and we have seen that. And like you, Cheryl, we started doing axial length on every child under 18 that we saw when we started the SMART study in 2007. So at that time, we were using ultrasound to do that. But after a number of years, we moved to some optical biometry, and been still doing it on every kid under 18. So there are definite signs of actually reduction, and we know we can't shrink eyes. So
so let me interject, Michael, and say it's very possible that listening to things that you said or reading things that you wrote may have given me that idea to do axial length on all these kids. So in case it was you, thank you.
No problem.
All right, so let's, if we're ready, let's move on to our next part of the topic, which is, why do we question OrthoK myopia control efficacy in low versus high myopes? Jonathan, what do you think?
A point about this is I feel like that's a clinical mindset of a lot of people in orthokeratology, and I've run across it in the whole gamut of OrthoK practitioners, whether it's a new fresh starting doctor who's starting to work with orthokeratology, or even a doctor who fits multiple cases a month. And I think it's just a preconceived notion from some older research that they kind of carry forward with them. And if not from that perspective, a lot of people have heard the idea that when you perform orthokeratology, you're getting a 1-to-1 ratio of your peripheral refraction to the degree of myopia that's corrected centrally. So I believe those are the two most prominent reasons that I've heard from people making that statement. So Cheryl and Michael, I'd like to hear what you guys think about that.
Well, I think the theories about OrthoK on low myopes have been proposed and reinforced from the podium without justification, without scientific research to back it up. I think a lot of it is proposed based on what is happening on the cornea and not necessarily what's happening in the retina. I don't think these types of theories are backed up with peripheral refraction type studies, and that's really where it counts. So I think it's theoretical, and as you led off with, Jonathan, there's a lot of things we still don't know about OrthoK, and I think that certainly is one of them. That really is peripheral defocus the only mechanism in play. There may be other factors in play, whether they be accommodative, whether they be other retinal factors, other peripheral axial rays that are not accounted for right at this moment. So there's a number of theories on that I don't think have been backed up with scientific studies. Again, some of the things that we don't really know in terms of myopia management and slowing axial elongation is if it is related to peripheral defocus, peripheral, myopic defocus, we don't know where the sweet spot is. In other words, is it 10 degrees from the macula, 20, 30 degrees? Is it nasal, temporal, superior, inferior? We don't know the sweet spot or the exact amount of myopic defocus we need to produce the best myopia control. And so the rest of what people are talking about right now is just theoretical. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with what Michael said. And to kind of look at it from maybe more the clinical side, I mean, I've done OrthoK on low myopes and they've been super stable. And then I've done OrthoK on high myopes and they're progressing, And so it's like, clinically, it's not like I always see my only progressors are low myopes. So
one of the things.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say one of the things that I note clinically is there's a lot of scenarios when I find that maybe I've tried a non-orthokeratology route on a low myope in clinic, and then I have another patient where I've done orthokeratology on who's a low myope. When I sometimes run into issues with still a rate of progression that I'm unhappy with, I find that I often very quickly run into walls and limitations on the non-orthokeratology patient because I feel very boxed in on the customizability of it. For example, speaking specifically of either atropine or some sort of multifocal optics soft contact lens. Atropine, you can increase the strength so much, and then you have to worry about side effects and symptoms, which is usually a very big headache for a lot of patients, I find. But then, if we go into the optical realm of the multifocal optics soft contact lenses, because our hands are tied based on the manufacturer's productions of them, you have very minimal to no changes that you can make in optic zone size in the amount of peripheral plus that you're pushing in the defocus of the lens. And like you said, Michael, a lot of it is theoretical, but to have the opportunity to change theoretical parts of an orthokeratology lens design, I think that gives you so much important value in that fitting. It's just, we're no longer happy sometimes with 20/20. We have a progressing myope, and then it's like, okay, they're still progressing. What can I try to change? How nitpicky can I get with this OrthoK lens design? Do I want to change the shape of the focus on the fovea to be more conical so that there's more plus fitting inside the pupillary zone? Do I want to increase the peripheral defocus? So I find that the value of the flexibility of OrthoK in a low myope to be hugely beneficial.
I'd like to kind of combine what you just said, Jonathan, with what you just said, Cheryl, and the point being there's individual differences in response to OrthoK to any myopia management program, and that some kids are going to respond so well. You think, okay, you have 100% control, you haven't seen any change, they're stable, and other kids you do the same thing with and they're going to progress. So there's individual differences, and you got to understand that that's kind of built into the system, that it's a human and they're going to respond differently to this. But remember, we can't go by the gospel of the studies. They're not, those studies, what are they reporting to us right now? Mean differences. So say they have 100 kids, which most of the studies don't even have 100 kids in them, and some of the kids will have zero progression. So they will have what's called 100% myopia control. Some of the kids will progress at the same rate as the spectacle wearers. And so they have 0% control. You get to the end of the study, and what do they say? 43%, with OrthoK, okay? Or 50% with this, or whatever it happens to be, axial length, refraction. There are individual differences, and we may not have the answers to say that the kid sitting in your chair in front of you is going to respond better to atropine than OrthoK, or OrthoK better than soft lenses, whatever. We don't know the answers. When that kid is sitting there, we don't have a measurement that we can look at and say, okay, OrthoK is best for you. We have it in our gut feeling, which is best.
This podcast is made possible by the American Academy of Orthokeratology and Myopia Control. If you want to learn how to do OrthoK, then we can teach you. If you're looking for a passionate community of like-minded experts, then consider becoming an AAOMC member. Or if myopia management just isn't your thing, that's okay too. Use the AAOMC online doctor search tool to refer your myopia management patients. For more information, visit AAOMC.org and join us. Join the war against the myopia epidemic. And, speaking of studies and lectures on the topic, I'm thinking back to a past VBD. Didn't Eddie Chow speak on this very topic? Are any of you familiar with his work and his lectures, and how does that apply to the discussion? Michael, what do you think?
I'm very familiar with that. He proposed a study from his numerous OrthoK patients, and it was a study that just basically retrospectively looked at all these kids and by age, and felt like the ones that were younger didn't respond as well, or they still progressed faster. Well, certainly he never factored out age out of that factor, and age is the biggest confounding factor in all of these studies. So he felt like it was all coming back to, like we were talking about, the peripheral defocus wasn't enough for a 1 diopter myope. So to try to get more plus, he basically instituted aspheric base curves, aspheric designs, to try to ramp up more plus within the pupil and to try to get more myopic defocus. And when they did that, apparently their studies showed this, but that it did produce better myopia control with these aspheric lenses, and he is still prescribing those to this day. But again, I don't think we can make generalizations that say that OrthoK doesn't work in low myopes. I think it is very effective. And one point that I think is coming out in a paper, a massive paper that's being published by Mark Bullimore and Noel Brennan about this concept of CARE, cumulative absolute reduction of elongation. It's expressing myopia progression in a different way. They've already had introductory papers on this, but it may be that all of these myopia management devices slow myopia progression in an absolute amount. And when you compare it at a various age where younger kids are progressing faster, it looks like it's less effective. But the example I would give is that, say for example, we pull a number and say, well, we can stop axial elongation by 0.2 millimeters per year, slow it down. Okay, if you have an 8-year-old who's normally progressing between a half, maybe, and 3/4 of a millimeter per year, that doesn't look like much. It looks like only 25% control. But if on a 12-year-old, you can slow that myopic progression, that same 0.2 millimeters, they're only progressing 0.25 millimeters per year. That looks like 80% control. Mm-hmm. So you have to look at these studies really, really carefully, and it's going to be a game changer when people start reading about these studies relative to axial length. And age is a huge, huge factor. We can't deny that. So.
Gotcha. All right, and with that, let's lead into the next part of our topic, which is what can we do to increase OrthoK myopia control efficacy in low myopes?
So I phrase this question this way because, as we all just kind of, I think, came to the decision, a lot of this is theoretical. So none of us are going to sit here and say, if you want to make this better, you have to do this. There is no right or wrong answer here. I kind of wanted to pull everyone here and just kind of get their ideas as to, let's say this is a clinical scenario. You're in clinic and you're treating a patient and they're still progressing, whether it's axial elongation or you're noting refractive changes from what you can measure at least. How do you guys approach this in clinic? What do you do? Do you look at additive therapies? Do you look at modifying lens designs first? How do you guys approach this? Take the lead, Cheryl or Michael, whoever would like to.
I'll go ahead and start off by saying my first approach would be just modify that orthokeratology lens. I assume we're not even talking about soft multifocals here. Maybe if they're in a soft multifocal, maybe I switch modality to OrthoK, but I'm usually going to try to change something within that orthokeratology lens. If you are not fitting a software design lens, that's sometimes where it becomes advantageous to learn one of the software design lenses, because you can do so much more with that and you're not relying on a consultant to help you make changes. I usually like to decrease the overall size of my treatment zone to, like you mentioned a little bit earlier, Jonathan, to try and get more of that peripheral power curve inside the pupillary margins to see if that will have enough effect on the peripheral retina to start to give me what I'm looking for there. Sometimes you can play around a little bit too with the depth of the return zone. That can be a little bit harder because that can start to make your lens too tight. But I really am not opposed either to doing like a combination therapy. So I've got a number of patients that do combo of OrthoK and atropine therapy. If I've already modified their treatment zone size or their OrthoK fit, and I'm still seeing more progression than what I want to see.
But you, Jonathan?
So I tend to be pretty similar. I do subscribe to the idea, at least for now, based on what I'm familiar with, that I want to modify the treatment zone size, as Cheryl mentioned. I'd like to increase the peripheral defocus. I'm fine with increasing asphericity within the back optic zone, as Michael, you had mentioned. Dr. Chow referenced the idea of. I like the idea. Sometimes I run into issues though with essentially when you do that, you create too much of a peripheral defocus to alter the refractive status of the patient. So in other words, it essentially ends up targeting too much and you end up with a hyperopic overcorrection. So I find that sometimes a limiting factor, but I try to squeeze as much out of the asphericity and the optic zone size changes that I can. Outside of that, then I'm moving to additive therapy as well. So I think I'm pretty aligned with Cheryl.
I think the key point that was made here is that customization is critical, and that we cannot continue to take one standard design, one standard optic zone, and expect it to work for everybody. For many, many years, I may have prescribed only one or two different brands of lenses that had very, very similar designs. And like we said before, some of them worked really well and some of them didn't work as well. Now, at least we have some indicators that are pointing us down the road of decreasing the back optic zone diameter of our designs to help with myopia management.
Yeah.
I had an interesting case too, where I had a patient who part of the reason I believe that she was a progressive myope was because she had a lot of accommodative issues. She had a high accommodative lag that we measured before we ever started treatment. And she was doing really well in her myopia management. But what happened about a year into treatment, and she's getting older, school's getting a little bit more challenging, she's got more homework, she came in with headaches. She's seeing great, axial length's fine, but she's getting headaches. And so what I did with her was adjusted her treatment zone size to give her more of a multifocal effect. And it took care of her headaches like that. And I thought that was really kind of fun and interesting.
Good.
Yeah, that's exciting. I think we all have to keep in mind, kind of circling back to the beginning of this topic, that these are all theoretical changes, but the reality of it is, what else do we have? I mean, we can sit there and just be upset with it, or we can try differences as long as we're still safe. And I mean, OrthoK for myopia control, regardless, is still considered off-label for this purpose. So we're within that realm of still, safely modifying a fit that's FDA approved for vision correction. It's just trying to achieve different types of vision correction.
I'd like to kind of bring this back to a little different level. We're talking about the eye and what we're doing to the eye, but I always like to bring it back to what are we doing for the patient. And I think if we know about myopia management, we know that the earlier we intervene, the more effective we're going to be. So I guess I always like to use an example of a 7-year-old who's sitting in your chair and bring it back to your clinic. This kind of an example is a 7-year-old is minus 150. They have an axial length of like 24.1. A year ago at 6 years old, they were minus 50. And they had an axial length of 23.8. Okay. Now, when you bring it back to the patient's motivated, parents are highly motivated, they're worried about progression, and for any myopia management intervention, we need compliance. My experience is kids are very, very compliant with OrthoK because they love to see, and they know if they don't wear their lenses, they don't see, so they wear them. But I'm a big one, with quality of life. They don't have to wear any correction. They don't wear that during the day, any correction. So I think to get back to the original question, would you prescribe OrthoK? Most definitely, yes. And I think OrthoK is the best intervention for a 7-year-old because I don't think they're great with soft lenses at that age. They have to be responsible enough to handle lenses and react to them and take care of them at school, if they ever get back to school. But, if that parent is asking you, okay, I'm concerned about myopia progression. I know you deal with this. How are you going to intervene to take care of my kid the best way possible? And I think certainly the first option is OrthoK in combination with atropine. You could do OrthoK alone and evaluate and add atropine later. Or in a 7-year-old, you could start with atropine only, and just kind of plant the seed for OrthoK. But in any event, I don't think a soft lens is appropriate for that 7-year-old kid. And I'd like to see if you guys would approach that any differently.
I'll speak first. I look a lot at just the patient's maturity level and the parent's comfort level. And if I feel like the kid is not going to be able to handle contacts, soft or OrthoK, I will start with atropine. But yes, I always am trying to plant that seed of, okay, well, let's get him comfortable with this. And then, if a year from now he's more mature and wants to start doing contacts, then for sure we'll jump into that. And I do talk a lot about the quality of life with the OrthoK. I think that's a really good point to bring up, Michael, because especially with my demographic and probably with lots of doctors who are listening to this, there's a lot of sporty kids out there. And to not have to worry about contacts during swimming or during a sporting event or, fill in the blank, I think that's really wonderful. But also, to the point you made, if they're only doing OrthoK and they're only doing it at a time of day when their parents are around, the parents do have so much more control with that young kid over what's happening. A lot of my really young OrthoK patients, like 6 and 7-year-old kids, the parents are often doing the insertion of the lenses or of the molds for them for the first 6 months or a year, or whenever that parent feels like the child is old enough for them to relinquish that part of it to them. And so that's a really interesting point that you made there. Soft lenses, yeah, if we're in a daily disposable, those are, usually fairly safe, but soft lenses are not the same as the materials that we use to make our OrthoK molds, and there are some risks that go along with that.
Yeah, just to chime in on your question, Michael, I think for me personally, I tend to think of soft contacts as the least valuable of the tools, but nonetheless, it's a tool. I think it might come to the forefront of discussion maybe more often now with the FDA approval of having a soft contact lens for myopia control. But ultimately, because of the limitations of it that I stated earlier, it's not my first pick. But I have to balance that out with patient expectations and motivation, because orthokeratology tends to be a definite procedure. It's a fitting process. There's a lot of time involved on the patient side of things. If that motivation isn't there, that's sometimes the only time that I'm perfectly fine going into a soft lens from the patient's benefit. But at the same time, I mean, it is our responsibility to get the patient and the parent to understand why we're motivated about this. So hopefully they can share that and make a more educated decision. But ultimately, I find that a lot of people respond well to that. It's just there's a few that they just want the simple, clean, and done. And in my opinion, doing a soft lens is not my first choice, but it would be better than doing nothing. They're not big.
I think it is really important, though, also to make sure that we have. I think it's important to make sure we have that compliance discussion with them. If they are wearing that soft lens, they have to know that it's not 50-50. You don't wear your glasses half the time. You have to wear that soft lens almost every day, with very few exceptions.
I think each of us is a little bit biased because we like OrthoK. We've had good experiences with it, its success, and gotten great feedback from the patients. But people who are not used to fitting GP lenses, are not trained in OrthoK, are going to fall back on that soft lens and say they're doing myopia management. And I don't know, I'm a little concerned about that. So,
well,
in some cases it's working great, but it is more narrow. Like, yeah, a certain number of patients are going to do great with that, but when you have that patient that is not stable in that soft lens modality, it's great to have the tools to say, okay, we have something else we can do.
All right. I mean, we went right into our next topic about how soon should OrthoK be considered for myopia control. So let's go to our next one, which is what degree of myopia, diopters, or axial changes progression would be considered medically appropriate to not intervene with some sort of myopia control method and instead utilize traditional vision correction methods such as single vision glasses or contacts. Jonathan, what do you think?
So this is an interesting discussion to have with this group here because I think we are all very much pro doing something for a young myope in order to help them in their future. In terms of progression, we all have a very serious passion and concern for those young myopes and likely progressing myopes. So for me, I'm hard pressed to look at any degree of myopia as safe. I do feel inclined to start intervening personally. As soon as I see the indication of refractive error development, or as Cheryl and Michael were discussing earlier, axial length measurements indicating that change is coming or is here. So I have a hard time not intervening and doing something, just because I figure we have the tools available to us now. It would be doing almost a disservice to not do something. Unless, of course, patient did not see eye to eye with me or the motivation factor wasn't there. So, Cheryl and Michael, what do you guys think about this?
Well, I guess if I, during a normal exam, talk to the patient and know the history, that the parents are nearsighted, that the kid is not nearsighted at this point, but maybe showing some signs of being at risk, the least intervention we do is education. And again, if the child is at a point where they need some kind of vision correction to function in school, then we talk about various options, and I always make a distinction between myopia correction and myopia management. So I don't think there is a age that you start doing that. It's just based on history and based on what you're seeing in that patient, trends that you're seeing and predictions. And I always hand out information to patients. I have it readily available to give them, and this is this myopia story, and if you know, this is what's going to happen to your kid. So
I agree. I mean, you have these discussions going on about what is standard of care, and is it standard of care to offer myopia management? And I would say we're probably not there yet. It's probably not mainstream enough. However, it's definitely moving in that direction. And at some point in time, it's going to tip to where if an optometrist sees this progressive myopic kid and they're not offering myopia management, or at least having that discussion, now they're going to be not even performing the minimum standard of care. That's, like I said, I don't think that's probably there yet, but as we learn more, and as we're educating all of our new doctors on it that are in optometry school, and as all of the CE is out there, it's really important that doctors do take it seriously, that at some point they're not going to be delivering standard of care if they're not at least having that discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel oftentimes in clinic, I don't know if you guys feel this way, but you know, you don't pretend to have all the answers and to be, you know, the fixer of everything, but at the same time you often kind of want to be a leader in thought in the standard of care. So as you said, there may not be enough evidence right now to say, well, of course it's nationally and internationally and worldly recognized as the standard of care, but in some ways I like to be a leader in that and say, okay, this is my standard of care. It's a little higher than what everyone else does, you know, who's not looking at it from this perspective.
You know, and patients appreciate that. And I think a lot of doctors that are hesitant to really incorporate myopia management in their practices, I think sometimes they think cost is a barrier. But I always like to remind myself, and I always like to remind my staff, it's not our job to decide what patients can afford. It's our job to offer them treatments that are available. And if they say, you know what, we just can't do that right now, we really don't want to do anything above and beyond, like, that's on them. At least we can give them the information and they can decide. It's the same thing as other things in optometry that are more specialized care. LipiFlow, for example. Like, I'm going to tell somebody if their meibomian glands aren't good. I'm not going to withhold that information from them. And then it's up to them to decide, are they going to take their fish oil? Are they going to do their warm compresses? Are they going to do their foam lid scrubs? Are they going to say yes to LipiFlow? But I'm going to tell them what I think. I'm going to try and treat these people like we would with my own family members and just be like, dude, this is what you should do. And it's up to them if they follow through, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that perspective, you know, just you have to, it's your one duty that is clear to all of us is that we have to be there for the patient and what the patient wants. And so if we can't relate to them what the options are and let them choose, you know, with some education, then I'm not sure we're doing our job. So I think it's a great point.
All right, are we ready for our ultimate question? Is OrthoK useful for control of low myopia? Jonathan, what do you think?
I'll answer. In my opinion, absolutely it is. I think it offers the flexibility and the customizability that is, to me, it's unmatched by any other myopia control treatment that we have available right now. And simply because of that, for me, absolutely.
Okay, Michael?
I wholeheartedly agree. Absolutely, yes. And again, I will go back to that example that I think OrthoK is effective for low myopia, and you can start younger. I think you can start at a younger age, like Cheryl alluded to, because parents are there to help, and it is effective. And compared to alternatives, I think it's better. But the younger kids are the ones that are the low myopes, and we have to start younger. So.
All right, Cheryl, take us home. What do you think?
Well, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but you all know I'm going to say yes, yes, emphatically yes.
Excellent, excellent. Well, that's all of the topics that Jonathan had for us in this episode. And so, Michael, thank you so much for being our guest expert in this episode. The book is called Contemporary Orthokeratology. You can find it at contemporaryorthokeratology.com. And if anybody wants to get in touch with you, how would they find out more information about you on the internet?
On the internet, they could go to that site and they could message me from that site. My email, another email I have is mjlipson@umich.edu. That's umich.edu. And I don't know, just watch for what's coming. I guess OrthoK, there's a lot of research out there. As a matter of fact, a study just was published today by our member, Jaume, from Barcelona, and it was a retrospective study on back optic zone diameter. It was published in the Journal of Clinical Medicine, and the study is a retrospective one, and it would never have gotten published on some of these standard journals because there's too many variables, and he used ultrasound as his axial length measurement, and that's not considered accurate enough these days. And but like I said, it's an interesting study to look at. You can't take it as definite scientific proof, but it's a really strong clinical indicator. So.
All right. Cheryl, where can more people find out about information about you on the internet?
So my clinic website is gretnavisionsource.com, and I have contact information on there. My email is Cheryl Chapman. That's DrCherylChapman@gmail.
All right, and Jonathan, this was your topic to present. I think we had a great discussion. Where can people find information about you on the internet?
So I work in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania at Eye Care Specialties of PA. My email is the best, easiest way to get in touch with me. It's jskoner, SKONER, at Eye Care Specialties with an S, eyecarespecialtiespa.com.
All right. And this episode was made possible by the men and women who are the membership of the American Academy of Orthokeratology and Myopia Control, who, spend their real life actual money to support this organization and bring you content like this. So if you've enjoyed our podcasts and you'd like to see more of them, consider becoming a member, and you can do that at AAOMC.org. And if you have any questions or comments about what we talked about in this episode, feel free to send the podcast an email at thecorrectedview@gmail.com. Michael, Jonathan, Cheryl, thank you so much. I think this was a great episode, and I can't wait to have you guys.
Well, that's it for this episode of The Corrected View. And if you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to thank the standard members of the American Academy of Orthokeratology and Myopia Control, whose annual dues and support make it possible for the AAOMC to put out education, awareness, and content like this. In fact, I'd like to take this moment to thank all of the AAOMC members who went above and beyond by backing our 2020 fundraiser last year. The contributions of all of our supporting members helped the AAOMC navigate its financial fallout that we suffered from being forced to cancel our annual education meeting, Vision by Design, in the wake of COVID-19. Thank you specifically to the following members who contributed at the level of featured member and above: Drs. Monica Allison, Dwight Barnes, Cheryl Chapman, Nick Despotidis, Steve Jacobs, Paul Levine, Albert Pang, Mira Savan, and Cindy Yu. I'd also like to give a special shout out that I'm going to be giving out at the end of every Corrected View episode for 1 full year. And that shout out goes to Dr. Somi O for her very generous contribution at the lifetime member level of our fundraiser. Thank you to everyone who contributed. and keeping the AAOMC alive. You are awesome.